أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. O Allah, show us the truth as true and inspire us to follow it. Show us falsehood as false and inspire us to avoid it. Ameen. And with that, I begin and I welcome my dear friends, my sisters in this jihad for truth and beauty, Leena El-Ali and Sitara Akram. If you guys have watched my podcasts with them before, we have already shared some great insights. Leena is an author of this beautiful book that I keep with me all the time, No Truth Without Beauty, Quran, the God, the Quran, and Women's Rights. And Sitara is a researcher. She hasn't yet written her book, but inshallah she will be soon. She is PhD in Islamic finance and has a very good grasp of Islam, what the Quran says, especially regarding women's rights, as does Leena. So today we have put together this panel discussion for a couple of reasons. We're going to be discussing Surah Nisa ayat 34, which is considered to be one of the most contentious verses in the Quran, simply because there are a lot of disagreements. In our opinion, there has been a lot of misinterpretation of this ayah, and a lot of hijacking of women's rights has happened because of this misinterpretation. So the purpose of today's call is to read the ayah and understand it, and also to demonstrate to lay people like me how researchers actually research in understanding the Quran. What is the methodology they use, so that we can also use that kind of methodology or a methodology that makes sense to us, so that we can understand the Quran. Another purpose is what we have been saying is, as women, we have been traditionally, not from the beginning, but in the recent centuries, we have been discouraged from understanding and interpreting the Quran ourselves, as if this right only belongs to men, male scholars, or just simply men. And we want to demonstrate that that is not true. That is actually not Islamic at all. Allah expects each and every one of us to interact with the Quran ourselves on a personal level, on a collective level, and we are supposed to do tadabbur on Quran ourselves. I heard this hadith recently that Prophet ﷺ said that 1 hour of tadabbur of Quran is better than a whole year of worship, which is huge, 1 hour of tadabbur. And why? Because this is the book of knowledge, and this book interacts with you and it guides you, and Allah gives hidayah through it. So tadabbur-e-Quran is extremely important. And Natasha, if you can please send me the link in WhatsApp on how to join this call right now, not the registration link, just the direct Zoom link, please. Not the panelist link either. So so that's one of the purposes, is to learn and understand the Quran ourselves together. Another thing why this is so important is because Muslim women as a group are one of the largest oppressed groups in the world. And many young Muslim women and men are leaving Islam, becoming very disenchanted with Islam, because they feel that the human rights that they hold very near and dear and ethics are actually not supported by the Quran, especially when it comes to gender discrimination and women's rights. And nothing could be further from the truth. And this is why this jihad is so important for every man and woman, is to really uphold those values again, and to show the truth about the beauty of Islam, which is egalitarian, meaning equal rights for everybody. It is also important because when you are armed with the truth, this is, you are able to win half the battle. When we talk about fighting for women's rights, what we're talking about is not an actual fight. It's not like we're going to take these dande sote and go and fight with men. It's about really, when you think about it, oppression happens because of ignorance. Ignorance is darkness. Ignorance is oppressive. The way to fight darkness is by turning the light on. And light is knowledge. So we share knowledge as our jihad. And you must raise your voice in order to share the truth. And it is basically also, if you think about it, dawah, which is one of the highest things of worship that you can do. You are preaching the truth. Also, in today's day and age, knowing the truth can help you so much in winning your rights. I keep this book handy as well, which is Daisy Khan's book, 30 Rights of Muslim Women. When I was talking to her yesterday, she told me this beautiful story of, she went to Afghanistan after the exit happened. Actually, her delegation was the first one to ever go to Afghanistan after the exit. So no other delegation had gone there. She went from America. And she said that the Taliban were amazingly nice. I'm like, are you kidding me? And she said, Iram, when they said something, all I had to do was quote from the Quran, quote from the Hadith. Every time I quoted from the Quran, I quoted from the Hadith, they would melt, they would soften, and they would listen. Because, we're talking about the same deen, same religion that they hold very dear. And we're talking about Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, whom they hold very dear. So she said they listened, Iram. And it was a first step that may not have changed all these laws and stuff, but this is how you engage people in a meaningful dialogue. Whereas she said then a Swiss delegation came and brought their chocolates and said basically, okay, here's where you're wrong, here's what you need to do right. And they, of course, said, go to hell. So that's number one. Another thing, when I was doing research for our talk today, I deliberately didn't read your book, Leena, because I wanted to make sure if I have questions, I pose them to you. But I was reading Daisy's book, and she shares this beautiful story. And I want to share that because I want to begin with that. And maybe I'll tell it again at the end if people miss this. But it was so beautiful what can happen when you are armed with knowledge. So this is the translation is by Leila Bakhtiar, right? She did this translation in 2006, and she presented it in the WISE conference, which Daisy had organized, in which there were 200 Muslim women leaders. And Leila Bakhtiar is a renowned Iranian American scholar and author of dozens of books. And when she presented her translation, there were cheers, there were, women, all because these were all women leaders. They were so happy. And later on, in 2010, a Polish-American Muslim woman brought a custody case against her husband, who was a Muslim doctor from India. And this is in America. She claimed he hit her for disobedience and withheld household allowance, depleting her savings before marriage. She avoided going to the police to protect her husband's medical license as she financially depended on him. She took her husband to court to fight for sole custody of her 4 children. In court, and I have seen this happen a lot when I used to volunteer for domestic violence victims, in court, the husband brought a Quran which translated, of course, he was using the other kind of translation where darabahunna, daraba was mean to scourge or to beat, to justify his actions under American Religious Freedom Act, right? So he was twisting the American law in his favor by using the excuse of religion. However, his wife presented the translation by Leila Bakhtiar, which does not mean to beat, but to go away from. The judge decided to use Leila's translation to disprove his religious freedom against the argument, and the sublime Quran interpretation was sufficient evidence for the wife to win the child custody case. So even where somewhere where he could have won using, you know, an excuse of Religious Freedoms Act, but because she was armed with knowledge, she was able to win. Laila Bakhtiyar passed away. May Allah Ta'ala increase her darajat. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We make dua for her and this amazing sister to be increased in her darajat. Ameen. So without further ado, I am going to begin by welcoming both of you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having
Welcome.
us.
Welcome. It is a great
Salam.
honor. Honestly, it is a great honor. I am so grateful that we are able to hold this first panel discussion, hopefully the first of many to come, inshallah, in this jihad for truth, love, and beauty. So, of course, we are going to be working on Surah Nisa, ayat number 34. There's a lot to unpack today. I made some rough notes. I'll just quickly go over some of the things we're going to be talking about. What is the meaning of Qawamun? Then we are also going to talk about fadl that Allah talks about in this ayat. You know, is it really fadl that men have fadl over women, or is it some over some? Like, what is he talking about? Spending from wealth, what does that mean? Devoutly obedient is another part in this verse which becomes problematic. Is the wife supposed to be devoutly obedient to the husband or to God? Like, what exactly is being talked about here? Nushuz, what does that mean? And also, of course, darabuhunna, which is about, does God really permit men or husbands to beat women? So there's a lot to unpack. And at the end, first we will present, and then at the end, you guys will be allowed to ask questions. And inshallah, you can put them here now. You can comment while we're speaking. You can put your comments in chat, or you can use the Q&A box if you don't want everybody to see your question. You can also use the react button to show us love, or, you know, thumbs up or clapping sign, so we know you're engaged and, you know, something is resonating with you. Thank you. And please know that, as has been announced many times, the reason why we're not doing it live to all of my platforms is because we want to keep it very respectful, like a classroom. We want to help, renew this tradition, Islamic tradition of creating and sharing of knowledge. So whenever knowledge is being created or shared, there's supposed to be respect, not just for people who are sharing the knowledge, but for knowledge itself, you know. And any kind of badtamizi or any kind of immaturity, any kind of abuse will not be tolerated. You will be immediately removed from this discussion, and because you registered with your email address, you will be permanently banned from joining any other discussion. So I don't want to sound like a strict teacher, but sometimes, as you guys can probably understand, seeing all the backlash we've had to endure on the social media, you guys can probably understand that. When we post the videos, of course, it's going to still be there, but there we're at least not being disrupted and disturbed, as our esteemed teachers here today are going to be sharing knowledge. So should I share the translation, or do any of you have it, if you want to share it on the screen, so we all have it in front of us?
I just have the translation from the Dr. Mustafa Khattab's translation on Quran.com. Quran.com is perhaps the easiest. If that's okay, I can share that just as
it's okay. They can put it up in the when they do editing. So what I would like everybody to do is, you know, use your phones or the other device, whichever one, to pull up 434, which is Surah Nisa, ayat number 34, and then we will go bit by bit. All right. So, my dear sisters, let's begin. If I may, if I want to just set this a couple of things, that in reading the Quran, Leena, would you talk about your methodology as you research and understand the Quran?
Certainly. Thank you very much, Eram. And thank you everyone for showing up. And Sitara, what a pleasure again, face to face this time. So The question, Iram, that you've just asked, I think is a very important one, because we tend to speak of ayahs as if they are independent sentences that are completely unrelated to other sentences or other verses in the Quran. And what happens when we do that is that, you know, we're essentially taking them out of context when we do that. You know, we hear a lot about how we mustn't take things out of their historical context. Well, we also mustn't take them out of their textual context. So in reading the Quran, it's very important with regards to this verse is an excellent example, actually, to make the point. I approach this verse very much by reading the verses before it first. And I usually, like, if someone refers me to a verse, I will go back not just 2 or 3 verses, I'll go back like a page or 2. So it's very important to do that, to understand the flow of the Quran. What point is it trying to make? What is the subject at hand? And then you continue flowing into 434. And when you do that, and I won't get too much into analyzing the verse just yet, I'll just mention a few things. So for me, when I do that exercise, and then I go 432, 433, and I land at 434, and I read the first part of 434, it's a continuation of the inheritance verses, an explanation of, or a commentary on the inheritance issue. Let's leave it there for a moment. Let's not get into it just yet. And then, you know, I read, it's quite a long verse, isn't it? It's like several sentences. So there's a lot that's packed in. So then I will read the whole of that, and I won't stop there. I'll continue. So in the case of 434, for example, I find 435 very, very telling. Yes. So I continue on with 435, and I read the rest, 436, 437, but 435 in particular turns out to be very relevant. It sheds light on 434. And then there's a third and last thing that I always do is I look at the verse and I say, well, where have these concepts that appear in this verse appeared elsewhere in the Quran? And I go and I pull out those verses and their contexts and look at them, do the same exercise with them. And then I come back to 434 and try to understand it. And so again, I'll give just one example. In verse 434, the word Nushuz appears. And so the obvious question is, well, has Nushuz appeared anywhere else in the Quran? Let's go see what it has to say there. And I go there, I look at the verses before, the verses after, try to understand it. And then I bring that exercise or the fruit of that exercise back to looking at Nushuz within this verse. And then I have a more, hopefully, inshallah, well-rounded and complete understanding, or at least attempt at understanding the verse. So this is what I have to say with regards to methodology. I hope that if people get my book, whether they buy it or download it, and go through the book, they will see that I try to be consistent in applying this methodology that I've just described throughout the book, whatever the subject is, whatever the ayah is, because I think we owe Allah our sincere effort and our serious effort, and the least we can do is to be, you know, as thorough as we possibly can and as consistent as we possibly can, because we don't want to be sort of twisting things here and there just to suit our preferences either. So that's what I have to say about methodology. And
I love that you say in your book that if you actually understood the Quran, you will find that Quran does its own tafsir. And this is what you were, you know, the methodology that you were talking about. And it is so beautiful, because as Muslims, if Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was going to be the last prophet, and Allah's book, this book was going to be the last time Allah was going to speak to the creation through his book, then why would he leave the book incomplete? So that never made sense to me in the past, that because a lot of, unfortunately, in some of these Islamic scholarships, the belief is that, oh, Quran is incomplete, na'uzubillah, and you need the hadith to understand the Quran. And the truth of the matter is, no, Quran is not incomplete. That is actually a pretty shirkiya statement. What would you say, or maybe Sitara can comment on that, when people do say that you cannot understand the Quran without the hadith? Because the reason why I'm mentioning this is because there are a lot of problematic hadiths which are not, they are disputed. However, a lot of times people will use a problematic hadith, disputed hadith, to misinterpret the Quran, and they will justify the hadith even though it is in direct contradiction to the Quran. And this has led to many misunderstandings, especially regarding women's rights, and also many sects that we now have in Islam.
Thank you. Thanks, Eram. I think I will talk about hadith, but I'll very briefly build on what Leena's just mentioned about her methodology. And just add a couple of things there in terms of my reading of the Quran, is that I do look at what is the overall mood of the Quran as well. Dr. Fazlur Rahman uses the word ilan for that. It's kind of the mood of the Quran, the sense of the Quran. So, for example, when you start to read something which might be oppressive or something which is unjust, you find that the Quran, it kind of creates this dissonance. And I know I've spoken before in our previous session when we had this conversation around the fact that the Quran is beautifully calibrated. It doesn't have contradictions in it. So if you read something odd into the Quran, it starts to create contradictions. And what Leena is referring to as what is the intratextual, how does the Quran's text relate to the rest of the Quran's text? If you read a verse, how does that relate to other verses? How does that relate to other usages of the same words, etc.? So the Quran has that internal coherence, and as Allah tells us, it has no contradictions. So you almost feel that the pieces of the puzzle are falling together, and the picture is clear picture is emerging. The other thing is,
I just wanted to say, I call it lens. You call it the mood. I call it, like, what is the lens that you're going to use to read the Quran with?
The lens that you use.
Go ahead,
exactly.
please. Yeah.
The other thing is a conscientious pause, which is an idea that Professor Khalid Abul Fadl builds on. A conscientious pause is when our conscience disturbs us a little bit. So you read something and it makes you feel uncomfortable. So now there's this niggly feeling in your heart that something just doesn't make sense. And what he says is that when you have that conscientious pause, follow it through. And if you're being unreasonable, again, your conscience is going to prod you a little bit, listen to it. We know that there are hadith traditions as well about that, where Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says that, the seat of evil is actually your heart, the seat of good is your heart. So the concept of the heart is very important. So that conscientious pause is really important. So when women and men are reading the Quran, if something feels odd to you, follow it through. I think that's important in our tadabbur, in our pondering over the Quran. Now, coming to the hadith question, this is a complicated question. We probably need another session just to think about how we engage with the sources of knowledge in Islam. The canonical sources, the Quran, the books of hadith, the Sunnah of the Prophet. I always differentiate between the Sunnah of the Prophet and hadith. I know the words are used interchangeably, but they're not interchangeable, because Sunnah is about actions. It's about the normative practice of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, for example, he's taught us how to pray. So he's physically demonstrated, this is how you stand up in prayer, this is how you fold your hands, this is how you bow, this is how you prostrate. So the 5 daily prayers come to us from his practice, which he taught to everyone. Hadith, on the other hand, is a collection of reports about the Prophet. It's the community's collective memory of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his person. And it helps to think about hadith as a historical source and to approach it with some information, with some critical tools at your disposal. Now, the reason for that is that hadith reports tend to be snippets of information. So they're not like a court report where the court clerk is typing everything out for you, right from the start to the finish, the whole proceeding in court, but what questions a lawyer asked, what did the witnesses say? None of that's recorded. What you get is a section of an incident, a snippet, a snapshot of an incident. What happened before, what happened after isn't there. Whereas the Quran is a miraculous text, as Leena is saying, the Quran makes its meaning very clear because it is contextually very nicely calibrated. So the Quran would build an argument. It will have consistency in its meaning. That's why we say that the Quran is in eloquent Arabic, in Arabi Mubin, clear Arabic, right? Hadith, on the other hand, requires a historian's mindset. So one of the tragedies we have now in our times is that because of the internet, hadith has proliferated a lot. So everybody goes on a search engine, finds a hadith about women and says, well, here you go, this is what the Quran means. But actually, what is being described in that hadith? What was the incident? Why did the Prophet make that decision? The facts are unknown. So a historian has to then collect those facts together and then glean something from a hadith report. So hadith is a very valuable source of information. It is also a very valuable source. I certainly found in my thesis when I was writing about riba or usury, was that some of the finer nuanced aspects of the hikmah or the rationale of different rulings were explained in hadith reports. Even things like when Prophet Muhammad says that the best of you are people who are in the best of akhlaq, in the best of etiquette, best of mannerism, that is an entire life philosophy captured in that one sentence. So hadith is actually very powerful in sometimes helping us explain some of the hikmah when we see it applied in certain contexts. So where Prophet Muhammad is using the Quranic teachings and applying them. But I think it becomes problematic when we say that hadith is the tafsir of the Quran, or that it is the only tafsir of the Quran, or if we take a hadith report and impose its meaning onto the Quran. So when it starts to supersede the meaning of the Quran, that's where problems emerge.
Yes.
So the Quran talks about the ontological equality of women, that women and men are equal in creation. But a hadith report comes in that says that women are deficient in intellect. Now you have a clash. And if you then impose a hadith report on the Quran and universalize it, you then hear things like, oh, but women are deficient in intellect. This is how God's created them. But that's not
And
what.
then you have all the other stuff.
And
also.
then you have all the other. But if you flip
This translation of this ayat, for example.
That's right. So scholars across the ages have critiqued some of this. We know from Ibn Khaldun, for example, if you read Ibn Khaldun's methodology of approaching hadith, he will say things like, is this hadith report contradicting historical facts? Is this hadith report contradicting what we know from the sciences? Is it contradicting what we know about culture and custom? Is it contradicting the words of the Quran? So he believes in what we call the content analysis of hadith, or matan analysis. So you don't just look at the chain of narration, whether that's sound or not, does it go back to the Prophet, but you also look at what the report itself is saying, what is the content of the report. And then, because the Quran is the final criteria, you have to then analyze it in the light of the Quran. I think the problem that we've seen is that the Quran is being analyzed in the light of hadith. So that's where the flip. Yes, and that's where some of the issues emerge. So often people, when I say these things, they hear this, and when they get very angry, they can very easily be triggered and say that you're rejecting hadith. So no, we're not rejecting hadith. If anything, if you approach hadith with that critically, academically engaged mindset, the beauty and the hikmah in hadith literature becomes obvious, becomes apparent. Absolutely. And that gets buried when hadith becomes politicized and it's used for certain ends. So in a way, I think it's an abuse of hadith when we misuse it, and we shouldn't be misusing it.
And there is a lot of evidence that hadith has been abused and misused, totally fabricated hadiths have been used to basically further certain mindsets and stuff. Sheikh al-Hadith, Sheikh Akram Nadwi actually says when he was doing research for his book, I think 10,000 or 1,000 muhaddisat, and he said, I found absolute fabrications of hadith by men. So that evidence is there. And he said, but I was not able to find a single fabricated hadith narrated by a female muhaddisa. But anyway, so yes, there is ample evidence that hadith has been fabricated. And what we have from Allah is that Quran cannot be tampered with. Allah promised to the sanctity of his book till the end of time. So this is the book we can approach with 100% confidence that it is true, it is accurate, it is correct. So that has to supersede, not just because of that, but it is the kalam of Allah. Whether it is, there are scholars disagree whether Quran is the creation of Allah or is it an attribute of Allah. So there's, two schools of thought. Whatever you believe, it is still, from Allah. It is going to be protected. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, let's begin. So Leena, since you probably have the best Arabic accent of all of us, I don't know, mine is pretty bad. So if you would begin with the first part of the verse, and then we start unpacking the different portions that we're going to be talking about today. So the first is...
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah. You want to begin from there, or do you want to begin from 33? Assalamu alaikum, this is Eram Saeed. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this content, please make sure to like and subscribe, and also to share with others that may need to watch this and help us spread the message. And if you haven't already done so, please go to jamali.love to download some free gifts that I have prepared for you, including a video that will help you to transform your most painful past trauma in 15 minutes or less. All these links are going to be in the description, so make sure you check that out as well.
So, well, first of all, let me just, if I can just make a quick comment on what Sitara has just said about Hadith. I couldn't agree more with every word that Sitara has just said about Hadith. There's a lot more to say about Hadith, as she implied. I would just like to add one little thing, which is that, in fact, there is a Hadith whereby the Prophet told us that after he would pass, after he died, a lot of words would be put in his mouth. And that the only way that we can know whether it's true or not, something is true or not, is to look at it through the lens of the Quran. If it's compatible with the Quran's message overall and its spirit, or in particular, on a particular issue, then we accept it. But if it conflicts with the Quran in any way, we chuck it out.
So we were being instructed by our dear Prophet. He knew what was going to happen and how to deal with the situation. That's beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. And that comes from Hadith. And maybe I'll just say one other thing very quickly, is that, we have great confidence as Muslims in the Quran, and rightly so, as being the direct word of God. But also, if we wanted to approach it from a sort of pragmatic a place or vantage point also, the Quran, as the verses were being communicated to the Prophet by the Archangel Gabriel, of course, they were being written down as they were being communicated on parchments. So over the course of the 22, 23 years of his mission, right, from age 40 when it all began till he died age 62, everything that was coming along was being written down on parchments. And within 2 years after his death, it had all been collected. Of course, everyone knew it all by heart in the order in which it was ultimately arranged by the Prophet through the Archangel Gabriel. But within 2 years after he had passed, it had been pulled together into a single volume, basically. So that's the Quran. So even if one was to approach it, and that's why Islamic scholars who are not of Muslim background also agree that the Quran that was had at the time, the verses that were had at the time of the Prophet, are the ones that we still have today. But we can't say that in the case of Hadith. And again, this is if we want to just put on a pragmatic hat for a moment and suspend our sort of the lens of belief that we come to it with. Hadith, on the other hand, Bukhari, for example, the collector of the most important, arguably, collection of Hadith, those massive volumes of Hadith. I mean, he wasn't born until 170 plus years after the Prophet had died, you see? So when they came around, it was 200 years later that this massive effort to begin to try and collect what the Prophet may have said, happened. So, it was a substantial, amount of time later. And also there are other things we have to think about, because if one chain of transmission says that person A heard it from person B, who heard it from person C, who heard it from person D, going all the way back to the Prophet, heard the Prophet say X, Y, Z, you also have to assume that every person in that chain understood what they had heard correctly and transmitted it correctly, and so on and so forth. So there are a number of very like commonsensical questions that we can ask ourselves also when we are examining hadith. But by all means, as Sitara said, we are not here to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
No, of course not. Yeah, it's
as
very,
much-
very valuable. Yeah.
Exactly.
And thank you, Leena. And I personally think that if Imam Bukhari were to be alive today and see what has been done to hadith, he would probably be horrified that this is not why I did this. It was meant to be a supplement to understanding, the Quran. It was not meant to take sometimes precedence over Quran. So let's begin.
Yes.
I think most of our audience understands that this is why it's important. First and foremost, we must make an attempt to sincerely let the Quran speak to us, because it does speak to us very clearly, and as we will inshallah demonstrate today. So
So now you wanted me to read the first part of the ayah, yes?
or if you want to begin with ayat 33 first, or
Well, we'd have to go back to ayah 432.
okay. So 430, we are beginning with Surah Nisa, ayat 32.
Yes, I mean, if you want to do it that way, it might end up taking.
Do you want me to just read the translation I have? Or
Yes,
you
go
want to
ahead.
read, or you want to read the translation first?
No, you can go ahead and read it as you wish. But the thing I want to caution on, because we can, if we're going to read all that's before, we can also go further back and earlier in the chapter. So I just want to caution people. So we're kind of doing an arbitrary thing now by saying we'll go back to 433 or 432, because the verses relevant to inheritance are a little bit earlier as well, like about a dozen verses earlier. So I just want to emphasize that. So we can either take it as a concept and go straight to 434, which might allow us more time to examine.
Okay, let's do that.
Let's do that, and then we can bring in what the verses before say. We can weave them in. I think it might be better. Thank you. So I'll just read the first part of ayah 434. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. Which is the part that essentially says men, and this is, well, it depends which translation you want me to read. I'm going to read my translation, which is an amalgam of translations. Men are upholders or maintainers of women with whatever God has favored some with over others, and with whatever they spend of their wealth.
Okay. So let's begin first with, we all understand ar-rijal means men, and then qawwamun. Of course, the first problem begins right here, because most translations recently have been that men are rulers of women. In Urdu, they love to say hukmaran. So let's unpack that. What does qawwamun mean? And what I'm going to do is I'll turn my camera off, so it's the two of you doing the discussion. And I'll, if there are questions, I'll bring those to you guys. And I encourage the audience also to, particular to this part, if you have comments or questions, I'll be checking the chat.
All right, so I'll just make a brief comment and pass it on to Sitara. But qawwamun basically means upholders, maintainers, supporters. And unfortunately, in many translations, it's come across as men are in charge of women, which has many other connotations. It almost sounds as if they're the boss, you know, when you use the expression in charge. Whereas the more correct, you know, something that is qa'im is something that is set up, held up, supported in Arabic. So, and I think in general, scholars have come around to fixing this mistranslation for the most part, so that qawamun is now, as I, you know, at least the impression that I have, people are generally accepting it to mean more maintainers, upholders, supporters. Sitara?
Yes, thank you, Leena. I've read your translation as well in your book. And for our audience here, Leena's book is available as an open source download, so it's free for you to download and read. And I would strongly recommend that you do that, because Leena's effort is more systematic, whereas my reading is wider, in the sense that I've looked at various scholars' views on that and then formed my opinion, rather than my positioning my own translation, if that makes sense. I actually read the word qawam, and it's taken me a long time to get to this point. I would say for the last 3 years, I've been grappling with this verse, because it's not an easy verse to understand in the Quran. It's, I think, one of the most complex ones. And I read the word qawam now as actually quite a revolutionary statement. And I'll explain that looking at the historical context in which these verses have been revealed. So we know that Ibn Ashur, who was a great translator of the Quran, and linguistically he was an expert in Arabic. And he says that the word qawam is a description of how society was configured at that time, which is that men usually had access to wealth, men usually had inheritance, and Allah is expecting them to become maintainers or supporters of women. So he sees that very much as the historical reality to which the Quran was speaking. And there are various views about it, but we know certainly that where scholars have critiqued the traditional interpretations, which consider qawam to be in charge or managers, you know, some translations would say men are managers of women's affairs. They tend to be the boss, and the women tend to be subordinate to them. Professor Khalid Abul Fadl, for example, says that there is nothing in the word qawam that you could translate as guardian or authority over women. So the closest translation in Arabic is around supporter and maintainer. And the reason why I think it is revolutionary is that at the point that the Quran is being revealed, we know that men use their power and their influence, both the physical power and all the material influence that they had, to oppress women. And that oppression was prevalent in society, from buying and selling women, slavery. Slavery of women and children was extant in that society. The Quran tells us that men used to bury their infant daughters alive, because they did not want to raise daughters or pick up the expenses of raising daughters, because girls were seen as a liability. And we know that violence and promiscuity was also very common in that society. Women had no rights. Women were also inherited as property against their will. The Quran says that, you know, do not inherit women against their will. So when the Quran is saying that men are qawam, I think Allah is making a really revolutionary statement. And he's saying that henceforth, I see you not as exploiters of women, but as supporters of women. So I think with that context in mind, for me, it becomes an emancipatory statement that you, from now on, will support women, and you will support them, as Leena will read further on, you will support them through how you spend on them. Bima anfaqu, as we find later in the verse. So for me, actually, it's quite a revolutionary statement and not just a descriptive statement.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies. And I want to mention here that I agree with the translation maintainers. I just did a workshop last weekend on divine feminine healing, and I actually did some energetic imagery around it as well. Upholders and maintainers is what is more dear to my heart and makes sense to me. I also love what you said, Sitara, that this was an emancipatory statement. It's so important to understand that, because while reading the Quran, Leena, you say that it's important to understand, of course, the historical context, why, you know, what was happening in the society at that time. Excuse me. And sometimes it's very important to pay attention to what is being said, and also to pay attention to what is not being said, because this is already assumed. So as readers, we must therefore understand the historical context. And excuse me, Mufti Abu Lais, in his video that I shared on my platform a few months ago, when I was watching his video, he said, you know, in Quran, you will find there is what he calls the ethical hermeneutics, you know, like you have you're supposed to go on an ethical trajectory. So something has been happening, and now Quran is saying, this is going to end. I want you to begin from here, but I want you to go on this trajectory and take it further. So that's also to keep in mind that Allah was basically stopping this was putting an end to the oppression of women. All right, so let's go further to the next part.
Can I just add one other thing quickly
Yes, please.
as well, that both Leena and I have used the translation men and women. We have not said husbands and wives, and that's important to point out because this verse is often interpreted from the lens of this is a comment on marriage.
Yeah.
And it's not. The verse is clearly saying that men are upholders, supporters of women. So it is talking about men in general, and that could be a father who's upholding his daughter. It could be a brother upholding his sister. It could be a husband upholding his wife. So all of those relationships are possible.
Thank you so much, Sitara, for clarifying that. And Eram, if I may, I want to, before we move on from the first part, this first part that we've just read, I also want to say that when we read, you know, the part about, you know, men spending on women, that's also I mean, for example, often it's been translated as men are upholders or maintainers, shall we accept that for now, of women because God has favored some over others, and because they spend of their wealth, etc. So I just want to bring in the fact that this talk of spending and whatnot is directly related to what has just happened in verse 432 before this one, which is that God says that women would be inheriting now. To men, their share, and to women, their share. So when you're reading 432 and then 433, and you come into 434, and it's in 432, God has just said, to men their share of inheritance, and to women their share of inheritance for what they have earned, in recognition of their contributions to society. And then you go into men are upholders or maintainers of women. Then you understand that, oh, so they're going to get whatever they get in inheritance, and with that, they therefore maintain women. So what you understand is that the proportionality question of daughter and son, for example, you know, it carries through with this obligation of men being upholders, maintainers, supporters of women. And some translations have then said because they spend, but it's actually the word in Arabic is with what they spend. So they uphold with whatever they have received through their inheritance. And they will be getting more. So with that, they will be, you know, become maintained.
Wonderful point.
There's a direct link.
Point. One of our audience members raised another really good point. Could we also take this particular ayah to mean that this is divine law, that men will be maintainers and upholders of women? So even if it is a man who is a stranger to me and is not directly related to me, is it his duty then to just make sure that whatever contact he comes with me, he is upholding my rights? And the reason why I'm asking that, Leena and Sitara, is because in Islam, Muslims are instructed to not just carry out their responsibilities, but to take it even to the darja ihsan, which is more than what you are responsible for, right? What would you say to that?
Sitara, would you like to go first?
Yes, I agree, because the Quran's general view of Muslim men and women working together is that they're the guardians of each other, they're friends and protectors of each other. The word used is awliya. And so as a bare minimum, what we can argue from this is that even if a man is a stranger, a Muslim man, even if he's a stranger, that he wouldn't be oppressive towards women. He may
Whether
not
it's non-Muslim even.
or
Yeah.
even if it's non-Muslim, but of course we're talking within the Quranic moral framework as to what God expects from believing men and women. So at least as a bare minimum, they should not be part of those injustices which are then oppressive towards women. So that then becomes a general duty. But of course, when relationships come in, then other things come in, as Leena's pointing out, such as inheritance, such as what you spend on your household, etc. So then it becomes a bit more specific.
I think this is a very, very important point, because you're then talking about at a government level also. If in the government you have mostly men, as is the case worldwide, it is a duty Allah Ta'ala has basically placed on men. Make sure if you're in the government that the laws that you make are not oppressive to women, that they are upholding and maintaining women, right? Leena, do you have anything to add, or should we move on to the next part?
We can move on. I mean, I think it's a lovely sentiment, and it would certainly be perceived as ihsan and in keeping with the Quranic spirit of things. I do not read it as a duty incumbent upon strange men as such, because it's in the context of inheritance being divvied
And
up.
relationships.
And relationships, and you know, in inheritance, there's also a big chunk you can leave to strangers, by the way. But because, you know, in the context of inheritance being divvied up according to specific formulae amongst relatives, then I see it more as related to that. But the sentiment is certainly, you know, if one, because, you know, there are two ways of approaching religion: doing the bare minimum, or actually doing as much as one can. And so this lovely sentiment that you've expressed, or idea, or somebody I think asked the question, is lovely, and it's really what we should all be pushing ourselves as individuals towards.
And I want to comment here. I hope that the audience noticed that we actually disagreed slightly here. I hope you guys noticed that. And this is how disagreements can be handled with respect, love, and still, you know, understanding where the one person is coming from, and understanding, like Leena disagreed because she is true to her methodology. So in her methodology, she's saying, you know, this is being talked about in the context of relationships. And again, if we just expand out a little bit and we see, okay, what is the general lens through which we read the Quran? And we are encouraged as Muslims to go to Darja of Ihsan. But I think it's an important point, because when you're talking about a hukum, it becomes obligatory. It's an obligation then. And what Leena is pointing out, rightly so, that it's not an obligation. So if a man doesn't do it for a strange woman, it's not that he's being sinful, but it's just, but in Islam, we also look that the micro and macro are always very cohesive. So if you can be mindful of this, if every man is mindful of this in his families, in his familial relationships, the society automatically will be cohesive in this as well. So Mavish is saying, if a man only supports his mother, father, and brothers and ignore the rights of wife and kids, well, that's understood. That's not allowed. And so this kind of question we'll address maybe later on, but obviously that's not allowed at all. So moving on to the next part in the ayah.
Yes, so I think we should spend a bit of time still on the same part actually, but the next issue that surfaces is faddala, right?
Because majority of scholars, especially the Pakistani and Indian scholars, have translated as they faddala, they basically say that because God has made men better than women. That's the translation that is usually used. Yes. However, that is not so. So let's dig into that.
Yes, I think this is an important one to stop at, because, you know, faddala as a verb can mean two things. Faddala can mean to prefer. Mm-hmm. It can mean to prefer. Mm-hmm. And faddala can mean to favor. to favor. For example, well, in English also, you know, you say,
we say it. This is from Allah's fadl. We say it all the time.
Exactly. Now, in this context, when it has been translated as men are maintainers, let's just go with maintainers. We've agreed on maintainers. So men are maintainers of women with whatever God has favored some with over others, and with whatever they spend of their wealth. The favor has often been said with whatever God has preferred some over others. And it's always been taken to mean because God has preferred men over women. He faddala men over women, so etc., etc. But actually here we're talking about, because we're still talking about inheritance and how some people get more than others. Some men get more than women, or at least sons and daughters, wives, but also some men get more than other men. Right?
Yes.
So with whatever God has favored some men with over other men, or some men over whoever you want to compare them with that, they spend. So it's very important to get rid of this idea that this part of the sentence, of the first part of this ayah, is saying that God preferred men over women. That is utterly unrelated to what's going on here. It is simply that, you know, some have been favored with more money, more wealth than others. And so with whatever God has favored somebody with, that is what they use, what men use to support women. Sitara?
Totally agreed. Yeah. Sitara, do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Leena. I agree with that. And I think earlier on in the same surah, Allah talks about this fadl, is that people think that they are the ones who have somehow, they have this preference because they have some level of superiority. And Allah says that it is He who decides. So we have this concept in Islam that sustenance and rizq and wealth actually comes from God. So sometimes people think that it's my amazing abilities and my strengths and my preference, my superiority over women, that I have been blessed with all of this. No, it's actually God who decides who's going to be blessed with what. And later on in Surah An-Nisa, Allah also cautions people against being greedy. And these concepts are all linked together, that this fadl that men might think is some kind of a how do I put it, some kind of certification of superiority. That's not what it is. So the Quran takes care, Allah takes care in the Quran to divest people of this idea, the divest readers of this idea, and says that it is what God has given you. And I think that's important to keep in mind as well.
I think, go ahead, Leena.
And as many scholars have recently pointed out, when this ayah then says, you know, men are maintainers of women, bima, you know, bima faddala Allahu ba'dahum ala ba'din, that does not mean because He has favored some over others. So bima means with whatever He has favored them with, using that inheritance that He has given some over others. So, you know, there's so many things within just that first part of this first sentence of this ayah.
Yes,
you know, you have the qawamun issue.
So much. Yes.
You have the bima issue, which means with, using the inheritance, not because. And then you have this, you know, preferred rather than favored issue, but they all tie in together and make sense when you remember this is a continuation of those inheritance verses.
Yeah.
Because of that you are qawamun and spend from whatever you got and whatever you have been favored to have more of rather than less. So all of this is packed into just that first sentence. So imagine if in 3 different occasions the translations or interpretations were doing their little preference thing. So already you've set up the whole verse to give you this mindset as you read the rest of the voice of, oh, women are not quite being treated equally. They're not being given full respect. So you're already getting into now the middle part of the verse with, you're a little bit on the back foot, as it were. So the psychology of it is very important to point out.
And I find it very interesting when I, read the Urdu translations. Bima is used, bima faddalallahu ba'dahum ala ba'd, wa bima anfaqu. So they will translate the first bima as, that because they are superior, but with the other bima, they will say it with, like they play with the words of the Quran by preferring the kind of translation they use. But if we actually paid attention, it would become very clear. Another thing to point out here is that when people say, a lot of scholars will say, men are superior because they spend from their money. And I think it was Asma Barlas who said, if that were the case, then we look at the marriage of Prophet ﷺ and Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, and she was the one with the money and she spent. Could we make that case there that she was, Nauzubillah superior? No, of course not. So you cannot use this as grounds to say that just because men are spending from their wealth, they are superior. God is not saying that.
Yeah. Can I, briefly come in here then, Eram, just building on that point?
Please.
That this is a verse about responsibility.
Yes.
It's often read as a verse, as I said, that a verse which is giving some kind of certification to men to say we're superior. This is actually a verse of responsibility. So what Allah is saying is that you have this financial freedom at your disposal. Use this to support women. That is the responsibility being put on them. It is not about anybody's superiority, inferiority. And I would argue that this still applies, because if 70% of the world's wealth is still in male hands, which is true, that is the latest data, that 70% of the world's wealth and assets are controlled by men, then I would say that that responsibility is still continuing because they have more financial freedom. So this whole thing is linked with a level of responsibility that God expects from those men, that he will reward them for because they are taking responsibility. But they will also then have that accountability towards God, that if they don't exercise that responsibility, then they're held accountable. So it is, for me, has always, I feel, been a verse of responsibility rather than a verse of preference.
In Islam, we see this, that the sunnah of Allah Ta'ala is that when he talks about favors, ni'mah, he immediately also mentions responsibility. So in Islam, we understand that we always have responsibilities from which rights will flow out automatically for the rest of society. By the way, we had thought in 45 minutes we'll be done with the discussion of the ayah, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.